The bankruptcy of MF Global has led to many, many storylines in the newspapers and in the press generally around things like collateral, trading, all those types of issues. And one of the ones that has not really gotten a lot of exposure discussion is the context of MF Global failing in the middle of the Dodd-Frank rulemaking. And we're going to talk about that today. And my guest joining me today to talk about that is George Bollenbacher, an industry consultant. George has a piece on TABB Forum that really digs into this issue of what can we learn from MF Global in the midst of sort of the Dodd-Frank rulemaking. So, George, thanks for coming here, and thanks for that piece on TABB Forum, because it has really gotten a lot of great readership on that. So people are clearly interested in this subject. And I wanted to start out by asking you, you'd kind of mentioned that there are two sort of key areas around this intersection of MF Global and Dodd-Frank. One is timing and one is sort of the regulation side of it. And I wondered first if you could tell us about your insight on the timing side of it. How's that impacting it?
Interestingly, as it turns out, these are both negatives and potential positives for Dodd-Frank as we go through this.
Okay.
In one sense, the timing couldn't be worse of having this happen, largely because all of the participants in Dodd-Frank, the regulators, the dealers, the CEFs, the DCOs, all tend to be the same people who are involved in MF Global.
Right.
So when you try to find out what's happening on a particular aspect of Dodd-Frank, and you call a regulator or you call the CME or you call one of the dealers, nobody's home because they're all working trying to find the $600 million that's missing or figure out who owes what to whom. Mm-hmm. So from that point of view, it could take the rest of this year or perhaps even longer before we get real clarity on what happened at MF Global and can work out the financials. That means that there are all these people who ought to be right in the middle of finalizing rules,
right,
are too busy putting out a fire.
Mm-hmm. Now, that speaks to our other issue around regulation. So if they're off trying to figure out what happened at MF Global and where those assets are and things like that, as you said, what's the regulatory side of it other than the timing issue around things perhaps being delayed?
Right. So the functional purpose of Section 7 of the Dodd-Frank Act was by clearing over-the-counter transactions, it would make the market safer and more transparent. People would know more about what was happening and who was involved and what the stakes were. Well, as it turns out, for a clearing corporation like the CME, it knows its customers, but those customers only know their customers. MF Global is a classic example. It was a member of the Clearing Corp.
Right.
So the Clearing Corp knew what MF Global was doing vis-a-vis other members, but it didn't know anything about what MF Global was doing vis-a-vis its customers.
Okay.
So partly from the point of view of whose margin money are we playing with here, it only knew MF Global's margin money, not its customers.
Right.
From the point of view of money moving around and how much risk there was, it knew the relationship of each member to each other member, but not to their customers.
I see.
So when we look at the much larger potential risks of OTC derivatives, if the DCOs don't know the end customer, there's still this huge unknown risk gap that we've uncovered with MF Global.
Interesting. And it sounds to me then like the this question of timing and people being focused on figuring out MF Global and regulation and how the MF Global situation is playing out, showing us perhaps some of the limitations around regulation are obviously very, very linked. My final question, George, is I wonder if, and you mentioned kind of at the top it's both sort of a good and a bad news story. If we think of the positive side of this, what can we talk about there?
Well, certainly one positive about MF Global is that it's not the largest player in the market.
Okay.
So there's an opportunity to learn from this what works in regulation, what works in clearing, and clearing and regulation aren't the same thing at all. They're two different functions. But what works in clearing and who do we have to have in the clearing organization so that we can keep track of their assets and risk and liabilities, and who the regulators are that are going to be watching this, and how do the regulators and the clearing organizations interplay. Clearly, the big dealers have an interest in keeping the market as it currently sits. Over-the-counter, direct negotiation, they're not pushing for a lot of clearing and transparency. But the regulators and the public need to understand how much knowledge we need to have, how much we didn't have, about what is a much bigger market than the one that MF Global was in.
Sure, right. Okay. So I guess at the end of the day then it's potentially a teaching moment. And the question then is whether people are going to learn anything from it.
Right, yeah. The question is whether MF Global is a watershed that leads us to a better regulated, cleared business, or the first in a series of bad events.
Right.
That's what we have to determine.
Okay. Well, stay tuned to TABB Forum, and as this continues to play out, we'll be sure to tap into folks like George and find out what's going on and how, whether people are learning things from this situation, these different situations, and how that's going. So again, my guest today has been George Bollenbacher, an industry consultant, talking about the intersection of MF Global and Dodd-Frank. Thanks for watching.